We're back in Samuel. I hope, actually, when Matt was introducing it, said that he'd spoke on the last section, and it was in 1 Samuel, and we're in 2 Samuel chapter 11. I'm desperately checking. I hope I've got the right text. I have, but we've actually missed out a chunk of chapters. More importantly, why would we go back to an old book like this thousands of years ago? Why would the church today go back to a book like this, book called Samuel? Samuel tells the story of David and the appointment of the king, King David. Why would we go back to it? Well, the reason is that we're back there because the church today is founded on the history of the Bible. And the history of the Bible is the whole story of God's people. And that's what we say, and that's what we believe we are today. We are God's people. There is a continuous line of the church today in every part of the world which sees itself as part of that ongoing journey of God in the world and the work of salvation in the world. And the way God achieves salvation in the world is through his people and for his people. And it's the story of kings, it's the story of judges, but ultimately it's the story of kingdoms. And finally and ultimately it's the story of a kingdom, which Jesus says he has come to bring a new kingdom. And so to understand the kingdom that we believe that we live in today, it's important for us to understand how the kingdom was formed and how these stories from thousands of years ago create pathways for us to understand the kingdom today, and also how God deals with his people. And in this particular case, what does it mean when terrible things are done by people who claim to believe in the God of the Bible? That's what this particular section is. Let me ask a question. What's the point of leaders in society? What's the point? What's the point of society? What's the point of belonging to something? Being part of a nation? We come from all sorts of different backgrounds today. Many will be part of the nation of Great Britain. It says that when I carry my passport. Got a blue one now instead of a red one. I won't go into the politics, but it disappoints me. Oh, sorry, said it. I carry my passport. It tells me that I'm British. It tells me that I live under the law of this land, under the structure of this land. That's what it means to belong to a kingdom. That's what it meant to belong to the kingdom of the ancient world, living under that rule and law. And of course, when Jesus comes along and he says, I've come to bring a new kingdom and to establish a new kingdom of which I am king, it therefore follows most obviously that the law and the king is Jesus, and therefore we live under his law. That's the transition that takes place. It means that when we come to the New Testament, we're able to say that in a way I live partly in this kingdom, but this kingdom of Great Britain, but at the same time, I'm kind of an alien in this kingdom as well, because there's another eternal kingdom which I live for and live in. And at the same time, living in that eternal kingdom, also in the New Testament, compels me to serve and do good for the kingdom which I find myself in today. Isn't that remarkable? It doesn't say you're in this new kingdom, so get out of everything, that hide away, disappear, go and establish something separate. It says you are part of the new heavenly kingdom, and part of the job of being in the new heavenly kingdom is to seek to redeem the kingdom that you are in now. The national kingdom. It's not to be in one instead of the other. It's to do good in one because of the other. So kingdoms are an essential thing. But we ask ourselves that question again. What's the point of leaders in kingdoms and social structures? If we see anything in the story of the Old Testament, what we see is God's people being established as a nation, as a kind of a people group. Happens as they break out of Egypt and they find themselves in the wilderness, and God establishes them as his people in the wilderness, and he gives them a law to live by. And from that point on, he says, I will be your king. But what do they want? They want to look like all of the other nations. They say, we don't want just judges to come and guide us in your law. What we want a king like everybody else. Okay, well, that's not the best, but I'll allow you to have a king. And so we go through in the in the first book of Samuel, we have this journey of Saul, the king who they appointed, who wasn't really the king that they should have had. And it's a disaster, and that's part of the storyline of 1 Samuel, is we establish a king who isn't the king that we ought to have. Why does God allow that? Because he's creating a flavor in their mouth. He's creating a test in their emotional senses. I know that you want a king, but you had a king, and it was me. And I was a good king. But because you weren't satisfied with me as a good king, I allowed you to have the king that you wanted, and now you've had a taste of what it means to have a king who is not good. But we're going to go on a journey because we're going to replace the king that is not good with a king that is good. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, God speaks of King David as a king who he has promised. He has promised the promised king, for the Lord has sought out after a man after his own heart. That's what God says about King David. Saul wasn't a man after my own heart. David was a man after my own heart. This is great news. You've now got a king who loves me. That's great, isn't it? And then we come to 2 Samuel chapter 11. Honestly, it is like 50% of our news or our films or our TV dramas. What is it? It's the ongoing problem through all of human history of powerful men abusing their position of power. And terrible things happening. That's it. We think it's bad now. We think it's all terrible now. There is nothing new under the sun. It's the same problem. I mean, sometimes we look at the way society is changing and we think we've made some progress. We think we've taken some steps forward. We think as though we're beginning to establish some sort of recognition of equality, and then it all falls apart again, and we have something like the quite appropriate pointing the finger at the issue of abuse, and we have something like the Me Too movement that emerges, and we think, okay, now we're on a journey which is going to be really good. Do you know what? We are on a hamster wheel that is thousands of years old, because David could have been part of exactly that problem. But just pause and think. David is a man after God's own heart and finds himself in this situation. That is a reality. The Bible does not, this is really important, the Bible does not present us with some sort of perfect picture of spiritual leaders who are wonderful and marvelous. They paint them as the reality, flawed characters, people who fail. Why? Because if the one taste is the flavour of us wanting a king that is better, the next taste is when we think we've got a good king and it all falls apart. We end up with the same flavour in our mouth. We want a better king. We want a better king. We've got to have a better king. We've put in a good king and now the good king isn't good anymore and therefore give us a good king. Please, let's have a look at the downward spiral. The first thing that we see in 2 Samuel 11 and verse 1 is that he stayed. It sounds like the national sport, doesn't it? It's springtime and the kings go off to war. It's kind of, okay, it's nice weather. Time for a good old battle. Reality is, there was a reason. The technology of the day wasn't able to move around in wet weather. And so they went on maneuvers when it was possible. And so it was time for wars to take place. You see what it says? Do you see the contrast of this? It was the time when kings go off to war, but David remained in Jerusalem. There's the start. There's the beginning of the downward spiral. It's time for war. It's time for David to present again in the language of the world of the day that the God, Yahweh, of the people of God is the true God. But he doesn't. He stays back. He stayed. Second thing we see is he looked and he took. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman washing. The woman was very beautiful. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him and he slept with her. The storyline that has repeated itself again and again, I'm pretty sure, and you Shakespeare heroes will tell me exactly where it appears in Shakespeare repeatedly, but it's just throughout our history. What a terrible woman Bathsheba was to not refuse. Oh, come on. The king sends for her, and she's powerless. And that abuse of power results in him sleeping with her. And he realizes what he's done. 6-13, and we won't read it, but 6-13 is David's recognition of the problem that he's got when he realizes that Bathsheba is pregnant. So if he stays, he looks, he takes. Third thing that he does is he schemes. That's the thing to do. Get Uriah back from the battle. Get him back in the city. He'll go back home. He'll sleep with his wife. And the thing will be hidden. It'll all be good. And so he brings Uriah back from the battlefield. And he persuades Uriah, he thinks, to go back to his house. Go and rest. Go and relax. Go and enjoy what it is to be back away from the battle. You see the mindset contrast between David and Uriah? David is in battle, but not living as though he's in battle. And Uriah has been brought back from the battle, but carries on living as though he is in the battle. Because he doesn't go back to his house. His mindset, his attitude is just astoundingly honourable. Just astoundingly honourable. How would I go back to my wife when my colleagues are out sleeping in the country? You've brought me back. I'm not sure why. I'm back here, but I'm not going to adjust into a mindset that says I'm not in the battle anymore. If there's one thing that we can take away from that we can grab hold of that idea and pull it into the New Testament understanding of what battle we're in, where we're told very clearly that our battle is now a spiritual battle, the times we fall over, and when we fail to remember that we're in a spiritual battle, and we end up living as though we're not in a spiritual battle, and we're caught off guard. So the scheme becomes even more complex. So what David does is he feasts with Uriah. He gets him drunk on the assumption that surely if I get him drunk, then he'll go back home and he'll sleep with his wife. You can almost feel the desperation in David. You can almost feel it. I've got to sort this problem. Got to sort the problem that I've created. Get him drunk, I'll get him to, obviously then, he's going to go back to his wife. And it'll all be good. And what does happen? What we see is even in that situation, Uriah maintains the dignity and the stoicism and the reality of his calling to be a champion of God's people who is prepared to live in battle even though the battlefield is a long way away. And once again, he doesn't go. So David has stayed, he's looked, he's taken, he's schemed. This just feels like, if it wasn't so tragic, it would be a brilliant plot, wouldn't it? And I think that's what the narrator has deliberately done in the way that it's framed. Because it's this spiraling downwards. It's as though at every step, he's trying to resolve the problem that he's created. He can't get himself out of it. Everything that he tries, it fails. You can almost feel the kind of sweaty palm as he's trying to work out what to do next. So he writes a letter. Having schemed, he now conspires. He conspires to murder. So he writes a letter. And he says, right, make sure that you go into battle, go towards the city walls, and then make sure Uriah's right at the front, and then retreat so that he's held back, so that he's by himself and he's killed. Verse 14 to 25. Others are killed as a result of David's conspiracy to ensure the death of Uriah. Do you feel the emotion? Do you feel the emotion of the tension? Do we relate to the occasions in our own lives where one thing we know we have done wrong, and then it multiplies, and it multiplies, and it multiplies? Or maybe, and this is critical because it's not hidden from God, we think, and then our thoughts go in a downward spiral. Jesus says, even if you've looked on that woman, it's as though you've committed adultery with her. And so we see the stark, the kind of, what this is doing is it's not just telling us a gritty story that we can stand on the sidelines and throw stones at David. It's a mirror that says this is what we are like. This is what we are like as human beings. And actually, David, in his elevated position, supposedly to lead society in the glory and honor of Yahweh, he becomes the greatest mirror of how desperately we can fall. A man after God's own heart, as it says at the end, the great tragedy in verse 27, the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. It became a tragedy. Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead. She mourned for him. Then once mourning was over, David brought her to his house and she became his wife and bore him a son who actually died. This child died. What do we do with a story like that? Where do we go? It's just tragic. In the story of God's people, in the journey of a kingdom, we thought we were there with a good king. We thought we were there with a good king, and it has now all fallen apart. What do we do? What do we do when we sit not watching David, but alongside David, and we say, yes, we've been in those kind of downward spirals of our thoughts and our emotions and our actions. What do we do? Is there anything that the story of David tells us? Yes, thankfully there is. Because David wrote a song about it. And so glad he did. It's Psalm 51, which we're going to look at the first beginning verses of Psalm 51. It's a song that he wrote, and the title of it is the song that he wrote when the prophet Nathan confronted him about what he had done. What we see first, beautifully, wonderfully, is the reality of a broken king. Have mercy on me, O God. According to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Yet you desired faithfulness even in the womb. You taught me wisdom in that secret place. That final bit, David is saying, the reality is, I am utterly without excuse. I have no excuse. But what does he do? He pleads for mercy. Those first 6 words are some of the most hope-filled words in the Bible when we're not pointing the finger at David, but rather when we're stood alongside David. Because we're able to say, have mercy on me, O God. He pleads for mercy. He acknowledges, I know my transgressions. I know I can't hide this from you. Have you been ripped open spiritually, emotionally? Have you ever been ripped open where your spiritual reality is laid bare before God, and you are left with nothing to say other than, I know my transgressions before you, and I know that you know my transgressions. Look at verse 4. He says something which is surprising. Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. And you say, hang on a sec, I'm sure it looks, according to the story, like you did some evil against Bathsheba. You did some pretty evil stuff against Uriah. In fact, you did evil stuff against the whole of the nation that you were called to be king over. Why does David say it's only you that I've sinned against? Because he is acknowledging that ultimately it is God who is the judge of all of us, the righteous and the unrighteous. Ultimately, we all, Uriah, Bathsheba, David, you, me, We all stand before that righteous God, and it is ultimately him that we've sinned against. It's not that he's belittling what he's done to others. It's saying, comparatively speaking, you are the supreme righteous one that I have sinned against. You know, and I know my true nature. That's the reality. We see a broken king. But you know what? We also see a restored king. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. That is amazing. That somebody who has done such an audaciously awful, desperate thing can come to God and say, give me joy again. I feel like my bones have been crushed. And the reason that I feel like my bones have been crushed is because I know what I have done before you. Please restore me. Give me joy in you again. But he says something really remarkable. Cleanse me with hyssop. Why does he say that? Because hyssop is incredibly significant in the Levitical priestly ceremonies. Hyssop is used again and again in the pattern of God. I think I might. I've just set off Alexa somewhere, haven't I? We've just got a Wikipedia view of what hyssop is. Thank you. Now let me tell you what hyssop is. Hyssop is this herb which is used in the priestly patterns of purification. It's ultimately what is used to wipe clean God's people. At the end of the ceremonial process of sacrifice, hyssop is taken and it is used to wipe clean. Hyssop is also the plant that is used to paint the blood on the doorposts in Egypt. How significant is hyssop in the ancient world? What is David saying when he says, cleanse me with hyssop? He's saying, I'm going to throw myself on what you've promised, which is that your Levitical law can forgive me for what I've done. That is audacious. It's outrageous. But it's outrageous grace. Because that is exactly what God says he will do. My Levitical law is sufficient to cleanse you and to make you pure. That's why David says, cleanse me with hyssop. It's not because he's saying, look, I'm coming to you and I'm saying, please show me mercy. He's not saying just please show me mercy because we're good pals, because we get on well. He's saying show me mercy because you've already promised in your law that that's how it works. That's what he's saying. He knew. This is the thing that I think we can hold on to today. He knew the true nature of God. And that's what he trusted in. That's what he believed. That's what he held on to. He knew what God was like, and he knew that when God says, I will purify you, that I can trust that. That's what we can believe today. How can we believe that today from a story thousands of years ago about hyssop and blood on doorposts and hyssop and purification and David committing adultery and committing murder and then calling for hyssop? How can we know that we can have the same? Because dramatically hyssop appears again. I think if it appears again in the New Testament, it's only because it's being referred backwards, because I can't remember anywhere else in the New Testament where it appears apart from this. And it's John chapter 19 and verse 28. Jesus is dying on a cross. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that Scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I'm thirsty. A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, it's finished. Tetelestai. It is finished. It is completed. The work is done. With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Because what Jesus called for, which whoever pulled on a branch of hyssop would not have understood the reason why they did it, I don't believe. It was just a handy stalk to get a sponge up to Jesus, but it tied the line between the hyssop and the purification of the Old Testament, and the hyssop and the purification that Jesus says he brings. What did David trust in? He trusted in the sacrificial system, but the whole of the sacrificial system was just the flavor, the taste of the true sacrifice. That's what Hebrews chapter 11 says. They saw dimly, they couldn't quite see it, but they were people of faith, and they looked forward. And David, this outrageous, adultering murderer, is described in Hebrews chapter 11 as a person of faith because he believed what God would do. He believed that somehow the God and the nature and the character of God was sufficient in his promises to purge us from our unrighteousness. And that is what this is all about for you and me today. That hyssop is critical for you and me today. Because it says when we find ourselves alongside David, we lean into the same sacrificial promises that God has made that says, I'll cleanse you through a sacrifice. Uriah, the righteous one in our story, the one who was clearly focused on the mission, was left out the front by himself. And he died. But there was one who was to come who was left out the front by himself, who died in a way that we can't even begin to get our heads around. David trusted the sacrificial system because somehow he understood that that sacrifice somehow carried his guilt. Somehow I'm going to trust in that to be purified at the end of the sacrificial system by hyssop. It must mean that my guilt goes somewhere. Guilt doesn't just fizzle away and no longer exist. It has to go somewhere, and it goes to the sacrifice. And that's where our guilt goes to. when we trust in the same sacrifice. Our guilt goes to that one who said, it is finished. It goes to the one who said, the bearing of the guilt is complete. I think it's striking that if the sacrificial system has a final purging of hyssop, that Jesus has hyssop appear in the storyline right at the point where he says it's finished. You know, it is so important to understand what it means when Jesus says it is finished. It is not a tragic, it is finished. Tatalesti, brilliantly. I love the way archaeology gives us insights and makes us think about the Bible as we go along. Tatalesti, we didn't really understand it until I think it was about the 1890s, when there was, from the ancient Middle East, there was effectively an invoice. And at the bottom of the invoice was written the word Tatalesti. It's finished. It's completed. It is paid. This invoice, this debt is paid. That's what Tatalesti means. Jesus' end was a triumphant end. It's completed. That's why I love 750 years before Jesus, the prophet Isaiah wrote this. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We, all like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Tatalesti.